Change your thoughts, change your health, change your life. Firstly, let's think how our thoughts affect the way we feel. For example, when you fall in love with someone, you feel absolutely amazing. You haven't swallowed a pill. You have created this feeling with your own thoughts. And then on the flip side, you can think about someone you hate and you feel angry. And again, you haven't swallowed a pill. You are creating this feeling with your thoughts. Many of us become prisoners of our own negative thoughts, and we spend a lifetime self-sabotaging with stinking thinking. It's only when you get your thoughts working positively for you that you will be able to live a life to your maximum potential. Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts. So be conscious of what you're thinking. There's a secret that all great historical and present thinkers, philosophers, and high achievers have agreed to be a universal truth. This secret revolves around this simple idea: you are what you think. English philosopher James Allen wrote, "As a man thinks, so he is. As he continues to think, so he remains." The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, he wrote, "A man's life is what his thoughts make of it." And then the poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "A man is what he thinks about all day long." And author Earl Nightingale said, "We become what we think about." And finally, Mark Twain wrote, "Life consists mainly of a storm of thoughts that is forever flowing through one's head." Now, all these great minds discovered the secret of living a happy, purposeful, and productive life. And it's this: we live in a world of thought. Our thoughts create our experiences, and thus we experience what we think. It is the quality of our thoughts, then, that create the quality of our life. Now, many of us who went through difficult childhoods, unfortunately, will have had a very negative program downloaded into the way we feel, think, and behave from our experiences. And the evidence of this can be assessed by how high your score is on something called the adverse childhood experiences. How the childhood trauma and the development of the adverse childhood study was born. A landmark study on childhood trauma began by very unconventional means in the 90s. Dr. Vincent Folletti was frustrated and searching for answers as to why his obesity clinic was incurring a 50% dropout rate from participants who were successfully losing weight. Now, Dr. Folletti began interviewing dropouts from his weight loss program with a standardized set of questions to try to find an explanation for the puzzling dropout rate. In doing so, he discovered that most of the 286 people being interviewed had been sexually abused as children and had used overeating as a coping mechanism for anxiety and depression. When his findings attracted the interest of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and epidemiologist Dr. Robert Ander, they teamed up with the Kaiser Obesity Clinic to survey more than 17,000 volunteer participants about a potential link between childhood events and their impacts on adult health. In developing a questionnaire for this study, Drs. Folletti and the team identified a total of 10 types of adverse childhood experiences, also known as the ACE study. These experiences were divided into 3 categories. You had abuse, which was physical, emotional, and sexual; neglect, which was physical, emotional; household dysfunction, which was mental illness in the home; exposure to domestic violence; separated or divorced parents; incarcerated family members; and substance and sexual abuse. The list of ACEs were used to establish an individual ACE score, or the sum of events in a person's background. Now, each ACE is considered 1 point. A person with an ACE score of 0 had not experienced any of the adverse events before the age of 18, whereas a person who had experienced any of those traumas could have a score ranging obviously from 1 to 10. Now, the link between childhood trauma and stress response, the ACE study results seem to indicate that it was not uncommon for an individual to experience some type of adversity during their childhood. However, the consequences for those with a high score were troubling, and many serious implications could be identified at a score of 4 or higher. When compared to an individual with a 0 score, those with a score of 4 were 460% more likely to become depressed, 390% more likely to have chronic pulmonary lung disease, 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide, twice as likely to have heart disease or be diagnosed with cancer. And they were also 8 times more likely to become alcoholics and 20 times more likely to use intravenous drugs, research shows. Now, as more research is done, more evidence surfaces about the harmful effects of ACEs. For example, a new study shows that a person who experienced persistent poverty in young adulthood and had lower cognitive scores later in life than a person who had never been in poverty. Now, the toxic stress response in the human body, renowned pediatrician Dr. Nadine Burke Harris likens the impact of toxic stress to a prolonged fight or flight mechanism. And she goes on to say, if you're in a forest and you see a bear, a very efficient fight or flight system instantly floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol, and it shuts off the thinking portion of our brain that would stop us to consider other options. Now, this is very beneficial if you're in a forest and you need to run from a bear. The problem is when that bear comes home with you every night. The prefrontal cortex is the front part of the brain, the portion that is responsible for planning, complex behavior, decision making, and personality expression. Toxic stress response, such as what's experienced by someone who is constantly running from the bear, results in a complex sort of rewiring of the brain, where instinct and emotion begin to override and even decrease blood flow to the prefrontal lobes. Now, as an adult, this can decrease an individual's ability to recall memories and create intense feelings of sorrow and anger. It can interfere with problem solving and judgment and result in increased reactivity. Now, the invention of the functional brain scanning in the 1980s revolutionized the understanding of what goes on inside our heads. The first scanning study of murderers was carried out in California by a British neuroscientist, Professor Adrian Raine. He was attracted to the Golden State not by the beaches, but by, as he put it, the large number of very violent and homicidal individuals. Over the course of many years, Raine and his team scanned the brain of numerous murderers, and nearly all showed similar brain changes. There were reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain which controls emotional impulses, and overactivation of the amygdala, the area which generates our emotions. So it seems that murderers have brains that make them more prone to rage and anger, while at the same time making them less able to control themselves. But why does this happen? Raine's study suggests that part of the reason may be childhood abuse, which can create killers by causing physical damage to the brain. The prefrontal cortex is especially vulnerable. A breakthrough came in 1993 with a family in the Netherlands where all the men had a history of violence. 15 years of painstaking research revealed that they all lacked the same gene. The gene produces an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A, which regulates the levels of neurotransmitters involved in impulse control. And it turns out that if you lack this enzyme, or gene I should say, or have low activity variant, you are predisposed to violence. This variant became known as the warrior gene. The warrior gene refers to the specific variant in the MAOA gene. This gene is tied to aggressive behavior and risk-taking tendencies. Now, monoamine oxidase A main job is to break down certain neurotransmitters in the brain like dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, or noradrenaline and adrenaline. These chemicals are essential for feelings of pleasure, reward, and how we react to stress. Now, some variations of the MAOA gene produce less of the monoamine oxidase A enzyme. When the enzyme is in short supply, the neurotransmitters mentioned aren't broken down as they should be. And as a result, people with this warrior gene variant, also called the MAOA-L form, might show heightened levels of aggression, impulsiveness, and a tendency to take risks. About 30% of men have this so-called warrior gene, but whether the gene is triggered or not depends crucially on what happened in your childhood. The MAOA gene only affects males due to it being expressed on the X chromosome, and women have two X chromosomes, which seems to counteract this gene. Now, in 2005, the National Science Foundation published an article regarding research about human thoughts per day. The average person has between 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts per day. Of those, 80% are negative and 95% are exactly the same repetitive thoughts as the day before. So by nature, most of us are thinking in the past because we're using the same hardware and software programs from our past memories. Focus on the now and don't give energy to things that don't make your life better. Now, there are thousands upon thousands of receptors on each cell in our body. Each receptor is specific to one peptide or protein. When we have feelings of anger, sadness, guilt, excitement, happiness, or nervousness, each separate emotion releases its own flurries of neuropeptides, and these peptides surge through the body and connect with these receptors, which actually changes the structure of each cell as a whole. Now, where this gets interesting is when the cells actually divide. If a cell has been exposed to a certain peptide more than others, the new cell that is produced through its cell division will have more of the receptor that matches with that specific peptide. And likewise, the cell will also have less receptors for peptides that its mother sister cell was not exposed to. Thus, if you have been bombarding your cells with peptides from a negative attitude, you are literally programming your cells to receive more of these peptides in the future. And even worse, you are lessening the number of receptors of positive attitude peptides, making yourself inclined towards negativity. So one of my favorite quotes, a Native American elder transferring wisdom upon his grandson, described his daily conflict well. I have two wolves fighting in my heart. One wolf is vengeful, fearful, envious, resentful, deceitful, and the other wolf is loving, compassionate, generous, truthful, and serene. And the grandson asked, which wolf will win the fight? And the wise elder responded, the one I feed. Our body and mind are intertwined. Every thought, feeling, and intention you have sends a signal to every cell in your body. They can be so powerful, they can affect our genes. And one experiment was done in the Institute of Heart Math, and it involved human placental DNA, which is the most pristine form of DNA. It was placed into a container from which they could measure its changes. There were 28 vials of DNA were given to 28 researchers who were specially trained in how to generate and feel strong emotions on demand. and the results were absolutely astounding. Each DNA sample changed shape according to the researchers' feelings. When the researchers felt love, joy, and gratitude, the DNA responded by relaxing the strands, unwound, and actually lengthened. And then when the researchers felt anger, fear, frustration, or stress, the DNA tightened up, became shorter, and even switched off many of its codes. When the researchers then felt love, joy, and gratitude again, the codes switched back on. The thoughts that we think and the emotions that we feel are constantly reshaping our DNA. Your biology doesn't spell your destiny, and you aren't controlled by your genetic makeup. Instead, your genetic activity is largely determined by your thoughts, attitudes, and perceptions. Now, epigenetics is showing that your perceptions and thoughts control your biology, which places you in the driver's seat. By changing your thoughts, you can influence and shape your own genetic readout. The biology of belief is a groundbreaking work in the field of the new biology by the author, who was Dr. Bruce Lipton, who is a former medical school professor and research scientist. Now, his experiments and those of other leading edge scientists have examined in great detail the processes by which cells receive information. The implications of this research radically changes our understanding of life. It shows that genes and DNA do not control our biology, that instead DNA is controlled by signals from outside the cell, including the energetic messages emanating from our positive or negative thoughts. Now, Dr. Bruce Lipton explained in his research as a cell biologist, he worked with pluripotential stem cells. Now, these are cells that can become anything when they grow up. He placed one cell in a petri dish where it was nourished with a cell culture medium as it divided into many genetically identical cells. Now, what Lipton then did, he split the cells into 3 petri dishes and exposed them to 3 different culture mediums, meaning the environment. What he discovered, I should say, was that the environment to which the cell was exposed to determined whether the cell became a muscle cell, a fat cell, or a bone cell. Now, even though all the cells were genetically identical, they expressed themselves differently. And the final outcome of the same genetically identical DNA was expressed as radically different cells. So the question is, what controlled the fate of the cells? Not genetics, they were all genetically identical. The sole difference was the environment to which the same DNA was exposed. Now, this demonstrated that the gene didn't determine the fate of the cells because they all had the exact same genes. It was the environment that determined the fate of the cells and not the genetic pattern. So if cells are in a healthy environment, they are healthy. If they're in an unhealthy environment, they get sick, and so do we. So what's the culture medium in our body where our 50 trillion plus cells are housed? It's our blood. So the health of our blood determines the health of our cells. Now, moving your body from one environment to another alters the composition of the culture medium, the blood. Now, the chemistry of the body's culture medium determines the nature of the cell's environment within you. And the blood chemistry is largely impacted by the chemicals emitted from your brain. Brain chemistry adjusts the composition of the blood based upon your perceptions of life. So this means that your perception of any given thing at any given moment can influence the brain chemistry, which in turn affects the environment where your cells reside and controls their fate. So in other words, your thoughts and perceptions have a direct and overwhelmingly significant effect on the cells and that's a quote from Bruce Lipton. Now, the scientific link between our emotions and health. Through the years, the scientific studies linking the emotions and diseases have produced an impressive body of research, all of which points to the conclusion that what we feel as emotions also results in how we feel physically. For example, in a 10-year study, individuals who could not manage their emotional stress had a 40% higher death rate than non-stressed individuals. A Harvard Medical School study of 1,623 heart attack survivors concluded that anger brought on by emotional conflicts doubled the risk of subsequent heart attacks compared to those who remained calm. Now, the Harvard School of Public Health, they conducted a 20-year study that involved more than 1,700 older men. The study found that the men who worried about social conditions, health, and personal finances had a significantly increased risk of coronary heart disease. And a study done in Finland, they showed that hostility is a major risk factor and predictor of coronary artery disease. A 9-year population-based study done as a follow-up to this study revealed that high hostility scorers were 3 times more likely to die from cardiovascular disease than low scorers. And then we go into Robert Sapolsky then, who's a PhD. He's also the author of the incredible book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, explains why stress can become a chronic problem and how we can reduce the toll it takes on our lives. And as he goes on to say, for 99% of the species on this planet, stress is 3 minutes of screaming terror on the savannah, after which either it's over with or you're over with. That's all you need to know about the subject if you're a zebra I should say, or a lion. If you're a human though, you've got to expand the definition of a stressor in a very critical way. If you're running from a lion, your blood pressure is 180 over 120. But you're not suffering from a high blood pressure, you're simply saving your life. Having this happen, the same thing happen when you're stuck in traffic and you're not saving your life. Instead, you're suffering from what is known as stress-induced hypertension. Now, we humans activate the stress response for reasons of psychological factors, and that's simply not what the system was evolved for. After only 2 weeks, for example, of raised cortisol levels, the dendrite arms of the brain cells, which reach out to connect with other brain cells, start to shrivel up, according to research carried out at Stanford University by Sapolsky, and he was also a professor of neuroscience. Now, the good news is, stop the stress and the dendrites actually grow back. So remember, it's not the stress that kills us, it's our reaction to the stress. Now, love can heal. Yes, that's a fact. It's been scientifically proven in a study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry. Scientists found that wounds heal faster in couples who are in a stable and loving relationship. Unfortunately, the reverse was also true. People in hostile relationships tended to have slower wound healing capacity, thought to be due to pro-inflammatory cytokines released when a person was sad, lonely, or the subject of abuse. The presence of this compound was found to be much lower in people who were in love. Now, a scientific project conducted at the University of Wisconsin was simply called the Forgiveness Study. And the study demonstrated that learning to forgive may help prevent heart disease in middle-aged subjects. So the incidence of heart disease was higher in those who admitted they could not forgive. And the risk of heart disease was much lower in those reported an ability to forgive easily. Okay, so retired clinical professor of surgery at Yale Medical School, Dr. Bernie Siegel, he goes on to say, I have collected 57 extremely well-documented so-called cancer miracles. At a certain particular moment in time, they decided that the anger and the depression were probably not the best way to go. since they had so little time left. And so they went from being that to being loving, caring, no longer angry, no longer depressed, and able to talk to people that they actually loved. Now, these 57 people had the same pattern. They gave up totally their anger, and they gave up totally their depression by specifically a decision to do so. And at that point, the tumors started to shrink. Now, in the words of Dr. Lisa Rankin, the author of Mind Over Medicine, she goes on to say, our bodies know how to fix broken proteins, kill cancer cells, retard aging, and fight infection. They even know how to heal ulcers, make skin lesions disappear, and knit together broken bones. But here's the kicker. Those natural self-repair mechanisms don't work if you're stressed. It's only when you're in a state of relaxation do they kick in and heal you. Now, an incredible story known as the Miracle Man, which is the amazing story of a gentleman called Morris Goodman. Now, Morris Goodman is a man who had made it in life. He had achieved everything he had dreamt of. He was a successful businessman, investor, and everything just went the way he wanted it to go until one fateful day. In March 1981, Morris decided to buy an airplane. He obtained his pilot's license on March the 10th, 1981. He took a flight around Chesapeake Bay, which is on the southern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula. Without any warning, the plane's engine lost power. Morris then attempted to maneuver the aircraft back toward the airstrip in Cape Charles, Virginia, to make, as you'd expect, an emergency landing. Now, as he approached the runway, unfortunately, the plane flew through a low-hung set of power lines and it crashed to the ground and flipped over. Morris ended up in hospital completely paralyzed. He had broken the first and second cervical vertebrae and his swallowing reflex was destroyed. He couldn't eat, he couldn't drink, his diaphragm was destroyed, and he couldn't breathe. All he could do was blink with his eyes. And this story goes on to document then the doctors who had done numerous tests on him concluded he would be a vegetable for the rest of his life. That is the picture they saw of him. But for Morris, it did not matter what the doctors thought. The main thing was what he thought. And he went on to say, even while sleeping on the hospital bed, helpless and condemned to the status of a vegetable by his doctors, Morris pictured himself being a normal person again, walking out of the hospital. He was hooked to a respirator in the ICU, and doctors had concluded that he would never breathe again on his own because his diaphragm was so destroyed from the plane crash. Now, the only thing that remained functional on his body was his mind. He used it to heal himself against the doctor's expectations. A little voice kept telling him, breathe deeply, and finally one day he was removed from the respirator. Just an incredible documentation of self-healing, and the doctors were at a loss for an explanation. How could a man whose diaphragm and swallowing reflex had been destroyed be breathing again? But Morris then had also set himself a goal to walk out of the hospital on Christmas Day, and he did it on his own 2 feet, as he had resolved to do it. And this story gets even more interesting. Morrison then had been told by the doctors that he would never walk, speak, or function normally again. But today, Morris walks and lives a normal life again. And he also goes on, he made headlines in 1981 when he recovered from the horrific injuries he had sustained in the air crash. And today Morris travels the world inspiring and uplifting thousands with his astounding story on self-healing. His story should inspire you today, whether you are sick or going through untold tribulations and sufferings in life, to overcome that challenge and live a normal life again. Now, every year, this is one of my favorite stories. Every year in Australia, they host a 543.7 mile endurance race from Sydney to Melbourne. It is considered among the world's most grueling ultramarathons. The race takes 5 days to complete and is normally only attempted by world-class athletes who train specifically for the event, as you would expect. Now, these athletes are typically less than 30 years of age. They're backed by large companies, such as Nike. And in 1983, a man named Cliff Young showed up at the start of the race. Now, Cliff was a 61-year-old and he wore overalls and work boots. Now, to everyone's shock, Cliff wasn't a spectator. He picked up his race number and he joined the other runners, to everyone's disbelief. Now, the press and other athletes, they become exceptionally curious and they questioned Cliff. They told him, "You must be crazy. There's no way you can finish this race." To which Cliff replied, "Yes, I can. You see, I grew up on a farm where we couldn't afford horses or tractors. And the whole time I was growing up, whenever the storms would roll in, I'd have to go out and round up the sheep." Now, they had 2,000 sheep on 2,000 acres. And what he would have to do, he said, sometimes I would have to run those sheep for at least 2 or 3 days. But it took a long time, but I'd always catch them. And I believe I can run this race. All of the professional athletes knew that it took about 5 days to finish the race. In order to compete, one had to run about 18 hours a day and then, as you'd expect, sleep the remaining 6 hours. The thing is, Cliff Young didn't know that. And when he was questioned, this gets even more interesting. So when the morning of the second day came, everyone was in for another surprise. Not only was Cliff still in the race, he had continued jogging all night. And eventually Cliff was asked about his tactics for the rest of the race. And he went on to say, to everyone's disbelief, he claimed he would simply run straight through to the finish line without any sleep. And Cliff kept going. Cliff kept running and Cliff kept running. And then each night he came a little closer to the leading pack. And by the final night, he had surpassed all of the young world-class athletes. He was the first competitor to cross the finish line, and he actually set a new course record to everyone's disbelief. So remember this, if other people doubt you, that's their problem. If you doubt yourself, that's your problem. So have complete belief in yourself and also learn to love who you are for what you are. And remember, genuinely, anything is possible, and I mean anything, as long as we have the desire to do it. And the only obstacle to its achievement is the thought, I can't do it. Well, I hope that you actually got something out of this video. For me, it always helps me as well. And remember, you get your thoughts working for you and not against you. Okay, and your thoughts are essential, as we've seen, for achieving optimum health along with an optimum life.